His fiancée humiliated the maid with coke for fun, unaware the billionaire was watching. Then everything changed. 1 second, a woman in a pink silk gown was laughing as she poured a glass of cold soda over a maid's head in front of 50 wedding guests. The next second, the room went silent. Because the man standing at the top of the staircase, the billionaire everyone was there to celebrate, wasn't laughing. He was staring at the maid's wrist. At a small silver bracelet he hadn't seen in 17 years. A bracelet that belonged to a man who died saving his father's life. And in that moment, Nathaniel Hale realized the woman on her knees, soaked in soda and humiliation, was someone he had been searching for since he was 16 years old. Hey friends, welcome back. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your country in the comments. I love seeing how far this little channel reaches. Tonight's story is one of the most emotional ones we've ever told, about class, cruelty, hidden family loyalty, and a promise made in grief that finally comes full circle. Stay with me till the end, because this one has a twist you will not see coming. Let's begin. Nobody in that mansion knew Elena Marquez's real story, and that was exactly how she wanted it. At 34 years old, Elena had learned to make herself small in rooms full of wealthy people. She had learned to keep her eyes down, her voice soft, her hands steady even when they trembled underneath the silver serving trays. For the past 11 months, she had worked as a housemaid in the Hale estate, a sprawling white mansion on the Connecticut shoreline that belonged to one of the wealthiest men in America. Nathaniel Hale, 34 years old, heir to Hale Industries, a shipping and real estate empire his father had built from nothing. Elena had taken the job because she needed it desperately. Her mother, back in a small apartment in Bridgeport, had been growing weaker for years, needing more care than Elena alone could give her. The pay at the Hale estate was good. The hours were long. And most importantly, nobody asked questions about her past. Nobody knew that her father had once worked for this very family. Nobody knew that 17 years ago, a car had skidded off an icy road in upstate New York, and a driver named Miguel Marquez had thrown his body between danger and the two people in the backseat, a grieving businessman named Richard Hale and his 16-year-old son, Nathaniel. Miguel didn't survive. Richard and Nathaniel did. After the funeral, in the chaos of grief and lawyers and a company that needed running, promises got made and then quietly buried. Richard Hale had sworn to take care of Miguel's family. But grief is a strange thing, it swallows intentions whole. Within 2 years, Richard himself had passed from a heart condition, and Nathaniel, barely 18, was thrown into running a company he wasn't ready for. Somewhere in that storm, the promise to the Marquez family got lost. Elena's mother never asked for help. She was proud. And Elena grew up believing the Hales had simply forgotten them, which, in every practical sense, they had. So when Elena saw a housekeeping position open at the Hale estate 11 months ago, she almost didn't apply. Something in her chest ached at the idea of working in that house. But desperation is louder than pride, and her mother's medical bills were louder than both. She applied under her mother's maiden name. Marquez had become common enough that nobody blinked, and she was hired within a week by a household staff manager who never once connected the name to anything. Elena told herself it was just a job. Clean the floors. Serve the food. Go home. Don't think about the man in the corner office who never seemed to remember her name, who walked past her in the hallway 100 times without truly seeing her. But today was different. Today was the day of Nathaniel Hale's engagement party. The mansion had been transformed overnight. 300 white roses, crystal chandeliers polished until they threw rainbows across the marble floor, a string quartet warming up in the ballroom, and a guest list that read like the front page of a business magazine. Elena had been up since 4 in the morning, ironing linens, arranging place settings, making sure every detail was flawless for the woman who would soon become Mrs. Hale. That woman was Vanessa Cole, 30 years old, daughter of Richard Preston Cole, a shipping magnate whose company was about to merge with Hale Industries in what insiders were calling the business deal of the decade. Vanessa was beautiful in the way magazine covers are beautiful, sharp, polished, untouchable. She was also, Elena had learned in just 3 months of working closely with the household, one of the cruelest people she had ever met. Vanessa didn't yell. She didn't need to. She had a way of looking at the staff like furniture that occasionally needed adjusting. She called Elena girl instead of by name, even though Elena wore a name tag every single day. She left messes on purpose to watch someone clean them. Once, she accidentally knocked a $40,000 vase off a shelf and blamed it on a housemaid who was fired within the hour, no questions asked. Elena had watched all of this happen and said nothing, because saying something meant losing the job that kept her mother alive. Tonight, 300 guests filled the ballroom in gowns and tuxedos, sipping champagne under golden light, celebrating a marriage that, as far as Elena could tell, had very little love in it and a great deal of money. Nathaniel Hale stood near the grand piano, tall and composed in a cream suit, shaking hands, offering polite smiles that never quite reached his eyes. Elena had noticed that about him before, a kind of quiet sadness he carried, like a man who had been performing a role for so long he'd forgotten what his real face looked like. She carried a tray of champagne glasses through the crowd, weaving carefully between silk gowns and expensive cologne, keeping her head down the way she always did. She had no idea that in the next 10 minutes, her entire life was about to change, and neither did the man who would soon come running down that staircase. Because somewhere upstairs, watching the party through a hallway window before making his entrance, Nathaniel Hale had just glanced down at the small woman in the red and white uniform crossing the ballroom floor and felt an inexplicable pull in his chest that he couldn't yet explain. He didn't know why. Not yet. The tray in Elena's hands had almost made it safely to the kitchen when Vanessa Cole stepped directly into her path. It happened in front of everyone. Vanessa's timing was never an accident. She had chosen the busiest corner of the ballroom, right beside the piano, where dozens of guests stood close enough to see and hear everything. "Watch where you're going," Vanessa snapped, though Elena had done nothing wrong. A small splash of champagne had touched the hem of Vanessa's pink silk gown, no more than a drop, barely visible. "I'm so sorry," Elena said quickly, steadying the tray, keeping her voice calm the way she'd trained herself to. "Let me get you a napkin." "A napkin?" Vanessa's laugh was sharp and theatrical, pitched perfectly for the small crowd now turning to watch. "You people never think, do you? Do you know what this dress cost? More than you make in a year, I'd guess." A few guests chuckled uncomfortably. Others looked away, sensing what was coming but unwilling to intervene. This was the unspoken rule of rooms like this one. The staff existed to be seen and not defended. "I'll pay for the cleaning, I promise," Elena began. "You'll pay for it?" Vanessa repeated, delighted, as if Elena had told a joke. She turned to the small crowd gathering behind her, playing to them now. "She'll pay for it. Isn't that sweet?" Elena felt her face burn, but she kept her eyes down, her hands steady on the tray, praying the moment would pass the way these moments usually did, with a little humiliation and nothing worse. But Vanessa wasn't finished. She reached over to a nearby table, lifted a crystal pitcher of dark cola meant for the dessert service, and before Elena could step back, she tipped it directly over Elena's head. The cold liquid soaked instantly through Elena's hair, ran down her collar, stained the white apron she had ironed at 4 that morning. Somewhere behind her, someone laughed out loud, a young man in a black tuxedo, his date beside him giggling into her champagne glass. The sound of that laughter cut deeper than the soda itself. Elena stood completely still, the tray shaking slightly in her hands, cola dripping off her chin onto the marble floor. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying in front of people like this only gave them more to enjoy. She simply stood there, soaked, silent, humiliated in front of 300 strangers, while the woman who had done this to her fixed her hair in a nearby mirror, satisfied, already moving on to her next conversation. "Someone clean this up," Vanessa said lightly to no one in particular, gesturing at the small puddle forming around Elena's shoes. Then she turned and walked away, laughing with 2 of her bridesmaids as if nothing at all had happened. What Vanessa didn't know, what none of the guests laughing along with her knew, was that at the top of the grand staircase, a man had frozen mid-step, his hand still resting on the marble banister, his entire body suddenly rigid. Nathaniel Hale had come down to make his entrance at his own engagement party, expecting champagne toasts and photographs. Instead, he'd arrived just in time to see his fiancée pour a pitcher of cola over the head of a woman half his household staff barely acknowledged existed. His first instinct was fury, a hot, immediate anger at Vanessa that surprised him with its intensity. But it was his second reaction that stopped him cold on the staircase. As Elena lifted her soaked hand to wipe the liquid from her face, her sleeve slid back an inch, revealing a thin silver bracelet on her wrist. Simple, worn, engraved with something Nathaniel couldn't read from that distance, but recognized instantly by shape alone. It was identical to one his father used to describe. One that a driver named Miguel Marquez had worn every single day of his life, a gift from his late wife, that he was wearing on the night he died pulling two Hale men from a burning car. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. His hand tightened on the banister. Slowly, without fully understanding why his body was moving, he began walking down the stairs toward the crowd, toward the woman standing alone in a spreading puddle of cola and humiliation. 300 guests too stunned by his sudden change in expression to say a word. Something impossible was clawing its way up from 17 years in the past, and Nathaniel Hale was about to find out if it was true. Time seemed to slow as Nathaniel crossed the ballroom floor. He barely registered the guests parting around him, the confused murmurs, Vanessa's bright laughter cutting off mid-sentence as she noticed the sudden shift in the room. All Nathaniel could see was that bracelet, glinting faintly under the chandelier light, and all he could hear was a memory that had lived buried in his chest for 17 years. He was 16 again. It was February, and the roads were sheeted in black ice. His father, Richard Hale, had insisted on driving home from a business dinner despite the weather, too proud to admit the roads were dangerous. Their driver, Miguel Marquez, had begged him to let him take the wheel instead. Richard had refused, until the car began to slide, spinning wildly toward the guardrail above a frozen ravine. What happened next, Nathaniel had only pieced together later, from police reports and his father's broken retelling. Miguel had grabbed the wheel at the last possible second, wrenching the car away from a direct hit, absorbing the worst of the impact on the driver's side. He died before the ambulance arrived. Richard suffered a broken collarbone. Nathaniel, in the back seat, walked away with nothing but bruises and a memory that would never fully leave him. At the funeral, 16-year-old Nathaniel had stood beside his father and watched Miguel's wife and young daughter, a girl who looked to be around Nathaniel's own age, maybe a year or two younger, clutching each other in the front row, inconsolable. His father had promised, right there at the graveside, that the Hale family would take care of them for as long as they needed. Nathaniel remembered his father's exact words, "Miguel gave us everything. We will never let his family go without." But 2 years later, Richard Hale was dead too, his heart giving out under the stress of a company in turmoil, and 18-year-old Nathaniel had been thrown into a boardroom with wolves circling, fighting to keep his father's company from being torn apart by shareholders and rivals. In the chaos of those years, the promise to the Marquez family had slipped through his fingers. He had tried to find them once, years later, hiring someone to track them down, but the trail had gone cold, a common last name, a family that had moved and changed addresses trying to survive. He had never forgotten his father's promise. He had simply failed to keep it. And now, standing 3 feet away from a soaked, humiliated housemaid he had walked past 100 times without truly seeing, Nathaniel understood with sudden, sickening clarity exactly who she was. "What's your name?" he asked quietly, his voice cutting through the murmuring crowd. Elena looked up at him, startled, cola still dripping from her chin, clearly bracing for another humiliation. "Elena, sir," she said carefully. "Elena Marquez." The room seemed to tilt beneath Nathaniel's feet. "Marquez," he repeated, barely above a whisper. His eyes dropped to the bracelet on her wrist again. "Your father, was his name Miguel?" Elena's entire body went still. In 11 months of working in this house, no one, not one person, had ever asked her that question. Her mother had raised her to never speak of it, terrified that revealing the connection might look like they were seeking charity, or worse, that it might reopen a wound the Hale family had clearly chosen to forget. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "He was my father." Behind Nathaniel, Vanessa's voice sliced through the silence, sharp with irritation. "Nathaniel, what on earth are you doing? It's just the help." Nathaniel didn't turn around. He didn't even seem to hear her. He was staring at Elena with an expression the household staff had never once seen on his face, something raw, something that looked dangerously close to grief and disbelief tangled together. "Your father saved my life," Nathaniel said, his voice shaking now, loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. "He saved my father's life. He died protecting us. And you've been working in my house for almost a year, cleaning up after people who didn't even know your name, while I did nothing. While I forgot a promise my father made at his grave." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Somewhere near the piano, a champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the marble floor, but nobody moved to clean it. Every eye in the room was fixed on Nathaniel Hale, soda-soaked cola still clinging to his shoes from where he now stood directly in front of Elena, and on the humiliated maid who had just been revealed, in front of 300 of the wealthiest people in the state, as the daughter of the man who had died saving her employer's family. Vanessa stood frozen near the piano, her face draining of color, suddenly understanding that the night, and perhaps everything she had planned, was about to fall apart around her. For a long moment, nobody in the ballroom spoke. Then Nathaniel did something that would be talked about in that social circle for years to come. He took off his own suit jacket, cream-colored, tailored, worth more than most people's monthly rent, and draped it gently over Elena's soaked shoulders. "I'm so sorry," he said, quiet enough now that only Elena and the closest guests could hear. "For tonight. For 11 months. For 17 years. Elena stood there in stunned silence, the weight of his jacket heavy and warm against her soda-drenched dress, unsure whether to feel gratitude or a fresh wave of humiliation at being the center of so much attention. Part of her wanted to disappear entirely. Another part of her, a part she had buried since childhood, felt something loosen in her chest for the first time in years. Someone finally knew. Someone finally saw her. Vanessa, watching the scene unfold, felt the ground shifting beneath her expensive heels. She stepped forward quickly, trying to salvage the moment with a bright, brittle laugh. "Nathaniel, honey, it was just a little joke. We can talk about this later. Our guests are waiting." "A joke," Nathaniel repeated, turning to face her fully for the first time since coming down the stairs. His voice was low, controlled, but there was a coldness in it that made several nearby guests take an involuntary step back. "You poured a pitcher of soda over a woman's head and humiliated her in front of 300 people, and you're calling it a joke." "She's staff, Nathaniel," Vanessa said, lowering her voice, trying to pull him aside, away from listening ears. "This is exactly the kind of overreaction that makes us look ridiculous in front of the Prestons, the Whitfields, half the board." "I don't care how it looks," Nathaniel said, and for the first time in months, Elena saw something in his eyes that looked entirely unguarded, an anger that wasn't performative, wasn't calculated for cameras or shareholders, but simply, purely real. Vanessa's father, Richard Cole, a heavy-set man in an expensive grey suit who had been watching from near the bar with growing alarm, finally stepped forward, sensing the merger he'd spent 18 months negotiating beginning to crumble in real time. "Nathaniel, son, let's take this somewhere private," he said smoothly, his businessman's instincts kicking in. "No need to let a small misunderstanding ruin a beautiful evening." "A small misunderstanding," Nathaniel repeated flatly. He looked around the ballroom slowly, at the 300 guests frozen mid-conversation, champagne glasses forgotten in their hands, at the string quartet that had quietly stopped playing somewhere in the last 2 minutes without anyone noticing. "This woman's father died saving my family. And my fiancé just humiliated her for spilling a drop of champagne. I don't think that's a small misunderstanding, Richard. I think that tells me exactly who I've been about to marry." The words landed like a physical blow. Vanessa's face went white, then red with fury and embarrassment in equal measure. "You cannot be serious," she hissed, her carefully composed mask finally slipping in front of the crowd she'd spent her whole life trying to impress. "You're going to throw away everything, the merger, the company, our future, over a maid?" "Her name," Nathaniel said quietly, "is Elena. And no, I'm not throwing anything away over her. I'm reconsidering everything because of what you just showed me about who you really are." Elena, still standing there in his jacket, soda drying uncomfortably against her skin, felt the eyes of the entire ballroom shift toward her, no longer with mockery, but with something closer to shock, curiosity, even pity, which somehow felt almost worse. She didn't want to be a spectacle. She didn't want to be the reason a multimillion-dollar merger might collapse in front of every important person in 3 states. "Please," she said quietly, stepping back from Nathaniel, pulling his jacket tighter around herself instinctively. "I don't want any trouble. I just want to go home." But as she turned to walk away, Nathaniel reached out and gently caught her arm, not forcefully, just enough to stop her. "Elena, wait," he said. "Please. Just wait. There's a lot I need to say to you. Not tonight, in front of all this. But soon. Please don't disappear again." Elena looked up at him, searching his face for the calculation she'd learned to expect from wealthy people. Some angle, some hidden motive. She found none. Just a man who looked, for the first time since she'd started working in his house, genuinely and completely human. She nodded once, silently, and walked out of the ballroom with her head held higher than it had been in 11 long months. The party ended early that night, the guests trickling out in awkward, whispered clusters, the story already spreading through phones and text messages faster than any of the Hale family's carefully worded press statements could contain it. 3 days later, Nathaniel Hale stood outside a modest apartment building in Bridgeport, Connecticut, feeling more nervous than he had in any boardroom he'd ever entered. He had spent those 3 days doing something he should have done 17 years earlier, searching for the truth about what had happened to Miguel Marquez's family after the accident. What he found humbled him deeply. Elena's mother, Rosa, had raised her daughter alone after Miguel's death, working 2 jobs to keep them afloat while quietly refusing every attempt at charity, too proud and too hurt by the silence from the Hale family to accept anything that felt like pity. In recent years, Rosa's health had declined significantly, leaving Elena as her sole caretaker and provider, working long hours at the Hale estate during the day, and coming home each night to care for her mother personally, sometimes sleeping only 4 or 5 hours before starting the cycle again. Nathaniel climbed the narrow stairs to their second-floor apartment and knocked, holding a small bouquet of flowers that suddenly felt embarrassingly inadequate for what he was about to say. Elena opened the door wearing simple clothes, her hair down, looking startled to see him standing there. "Mr. Hale," she said, glancing behind her instinctively, as if checking whether the apartment was presentable enough for a billionaire's unannounced visit. "I wasn't expecting." "Please, call me Nathaniel," he said quickly. "And I'm sorry for showing up like this. I got your address from HR. I hope that's all right. I needed to see you. To talk properly. Not in front of a crowd." Elena hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was small but immaculately clean, warm despite its modesty, filled with framed photographs. Elena as a child, a man Nathaniel recognized instantly from old family photos, smiling in a driver's uniform with his arm around a young wife and daughter. Nathaniel's throat tightened at the sight of Miguel Marquez's face, unchanged from his memory, frozen forever at 30-something years old. "I owe you an explanation," Nathaniel said, sitting carefully on the offered chair. "And an apology that's 17 years too late." He told her everything, the promise at the graveside, the 2 years of chaos after his father's death, the search that had gone cold, the guilt that had quietly followed him into adulthood without him ever fully confronting it. Elena listened in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap, tears eventually slipping down her cheeks despite her best efforts to hold them back. "I used to hate your family," she admitted quietly, once he'd finished. "Not you specifically. I didn't know you, not really. But I hated the idea of the Hales. My mother always told me your father made a promise he never kept. That we were forgotten the moment my father was in the ground. You weren't forgotten, Nathaniel said softly. You were failed. There's a difference, but I understand if it doesn't feel like much of one. Why did you hire me, then? Elena asked suddenly, a flicker of suspicion crossing her face. If you knew who I was. I didn't know, Nathaniel said honestly. Not until 3 nights ago, when I saw that bracelet on your wrist. I swear to you, Elena, I had no idea Elena Marquez, my housemaid, was the same little girl I saw crying at a graveside 17 years ago. If I had known, I would never have let you clean my floors while I forgot to check on your family for over a decade. Elena studied his face carefully, searching for dishonesty, and found none. Slowly, some of the tension in her shoulders eased. My mother is sick, she said finally, quietly, the admission costing her visibly. Has been for years. That's why I took the job at your house. I needed the money, and I needed it fast, and I told myself it was just a coincidence that it was your family. I never planned to tell anyone who I really was. Let me help, Nathaniel said immediately. Properly. Not charity, a debt finally being paid. Your mother deserves the best care available, and I have both the means and the obligation to make sure she gets it. Elena's pride flared instantly. I don't want your pity, Mr. Hale. It's not pity, Nathaniel said firmly, meeting her eyes. It's 17 years overdue. Please, Elena. Let me finally keep my father's promise. While Nathaniel worked to make things right with the Marquez family, Vanessa Cole was fighting a very different battle. One for her reputation, and increasingly, for her carefully constructed future. The engagement party disaster had exploded across social circles and eventually, quietly, into the local business press. Reporters, sensing a juicy story involving old money and public humiliation, began digging, and what they found painted a picture of Vanessa Cole that was far from the polished philanthropist image she had spent years cultivating. It started small. An anonymous tip led one persistent reporter to a former assistant of Vanessa's, fired 2 years earlier under mysterious circumstances, who was suddenly willing to talk. The assistant described a pattern eerily similar to what had happened at the party. Public humiliations, targeted cruelty toward anyone she viewed as beneath her, threats disguised as jokes. Then came whispers about the merger itself. Vanessa's father, Richard Cole, had been quietly using the engagement to shore up his own struggling shipping company, which, unknown to Nathaniel, had been hemorrhaging money for the past 2 years due to a series of bad investments Richard had desperately tried to hide from potential partners. The marriage between Vanessa and Nathaniel wasn't simply a business alliance. It was, in many ways, a financial lifeline for a company on the brink of collapse, dressed up in wedding invitations and champagne toasts. Vanessa had known about her father's desperation for months. She had known the merger, and therefore the marriage, needed to happen quickly and cleanly, without scandal. And she had convinced herself, in the arrogant confidence of someone who had never truly been told no, that a little cruelty toward invisible household staff would never be the thing to threaten it all. She was wrong. Nathaniel called an emergency meeting with his legal and financial teams days after visiting Elena's apartment, quietly beginning to unravel exactly what he had almost married into. What he discovered troubled him deeply, not just Vanessa's behavior, but the extent to which her father had misrepresented his company's financial health during merger negotiations, numbers that, had they gone unnoticed, could have cost Hale Industries millions and damaged its reputation for years. When Nathaniel confronted Vanessa privately at her family's Greenwich estate, she didn't bother denying any of it. Something had shifted in her since the party. The polished mask had cracked, and underneath it was something far more desperate and far less sympathetic than Nathaniel had expected. "You have no idea what it's like," she snapped, pacing furiously across her father's study. "Growing up constantly being told the company might collapse, that everything I have could disappear overnight unless I marry well. I did what I had to do. You humiliated an innocent woman for entertainment," Nathaniel said quietly. That's not survival, Vanessa. That's cruelty. And you did it because you assumed no one important would ever care enough to stop you. And what, you're the hero now? Vanessa shot back, bitterness dripping from every word. Falling for the help because she has a sad backstory. Do you hear yourself? I'm not falling for anyone, Nathaniel said, though even as he said it, some quiet part of him wondered if that was entirely true. I'm ending an engagement to someone who showed me exactly who she is, and I'm grateful I found out now instead of after the wedding. Vanessa's face twisted with fury, but underneath it, Nathaniel could see something closer to panic. Without this marriage, without this merger, her father's company would very likely collapse within the year, taking the Cole family's entire fortune and reputation down with it. You'll regret this, she hissed as he turned to leave. Everyone will know you threw away the deal of the decade over some maid's feelings. Nathaniel paused at the door and looked back at her one last time. I think, he said quietly, everyone is going to understand exactly why I did. News of the broken engagement spread fast, but not in the direction Vanessa had threatened. Rather than painting Nathaniel as a foolish businessman throwing away a lucrative merger over sentiment, the story that captured public attention, fueled first by party guests who had witnessed the scene firsthand, then by increasingly detailed press coverage, was one of quiet, old-fashioned honor. A billionaire who had discovered, in a single devastating moment, that his own household had been hiding the daughter of a man who died a hero, and who had chosen decency over convenience once he found out. Public sentiment shifted rapidly in Nathaniel's favor. Business partners who had privately worried about Vanessa's reputation for years quietly reached out to express support. Even competing companies, sensing an opportunity, began offering Hale Industries far more favorable merger terms than Richard Cole's company ever had. But for Nathaniel, the business fallout mattered far less than what was happening in Bridgeport. In the weeks that followed, he visited Elena and her mother regularly. First to oversee arrangements for Rosa's medical care at one of the finest facilities in the state, and later, simply because he wanted to. Rosa Marquez, weak but sharp-eyed, watched the growing warmth between her daughter and the young man who now sat at her kitchen table several evenings a week with something between suspicion and quiet hope. You know, Rosa said to him one evening, while Elena was in the kitchen making tea, Miguel always said the Hale family had good hearts buried under all that money. He just didn't live long enough to prove it. I'm trying to prove it now, Nathaniel said quietly. Better late than never, I hope. Better late than never, Rosa agreed, studying him carefully. But don't confuse guilt with love, Mr. Hale. My daughter deserves to be chosen for herself. Not as a way to settle old debts. Nathaniel took her words seriously. He began, slowly and deliberately, separating the debt he owed the Marquez family, which he continued to honor fully, funding Rosa's care completely and setting up a trust in Miguel's memory for future household staff scholarship funds, from whatever was quietly, unmistakably growing between himself and Elena. Elena, for her part, resigned from her position as a housemaid within a month, not out of anger, but because both of them understood the strange dynamic could no longer continue as it had. Nathaniel offered her a role instead within the Hale Industries Scholarship Foundation he was expanding in her father's honor, a position she initially resisted fiercely, terrified of being seen as someone who had simply traded humiliation for a shortcut to comfort. I don't want people thinking I only got this because of what happened at that party, she told him firmly during the interview he insisted on conducting formally, despite both of them knowing the job was already hers. Then earn it the way you've earned everything else in your life, Nathaniel said simply. I'm not offering you charity, Elena. I'm offering you an opportunity. What you do with it is entirely up to you. She took the job. Within 6 months, colleagues who worked alongside her had no idea about the scandal that had once put her name across local newspapers. They simply saw a sharp, dedicated woman who cared deeply about the foundation's mission of supporting families of employees who had sacrificed everything for others, just as her father once had. Not everyone was ready to let the story end quietly. Vanessa, humiliated publicly and watching her father's company slide toward collapse without the Hale merger, grew increasingly desperate as the months passed. Her father, Richard Cole, facing mounting pressure from shareholders and creditors, pushed her relentlessly to find some way to salvage the family's reputation and finances. In a final, reckless move, Vanessa reached out to a tabloid reporter with a fabricated story, claiming that Elena had somehow orchestrated the entire scene at the engagement party, manipulating Nathaniel with a sob story about her father's death to worm her way into his fortune. She provided doctored text messages, paid a former Hale household employee to give a false statement, and leaked the story just as Nathaniel and Elena were preparing to attend a charity gala together for the first time as a public couple. The story broke online the morning of the gala, threatening to undo months of quiet healing with a single, cruel headline, "Gold-digging maid manipulated grieving billionaire," sources claim. Elena was devastated when she saw it, curled up on her apartment couch with her phone in shaking hands, the old fear of public humiliation crashing back over her all at once. "I can't do this," she told Nathaniel over the phone, her voice breaking. "I can't go tonight. Everyone will be staring, everyone will believe it." "Elena, listen to me," Nathaniel said firmly, already in his car heading toward her apartment. "I'm not going to let one desperate lie undo everything you've built these past few months. We're going to that gala tonight, together, and we're going to face this head on. Running and hiding is exactly what she wants." By the time Nathaniel arrived, his legal team had already begun tracing the doctored messages back to their source, and within hours, uncovered undeniable proof, including a financial transaction paid directly from a Cole family account to the household employee who'd given the false statement. That evening, standing together at the entrance of the gala under a wall of camera flashes and hushed whispers, Nathaniel didn't hide from the story. Instead, he addressed it directly, calmly, in front of the assembled press. "Some of you have seen a story published this morning about Elena Marquez," he said, his arm steady around her shoulders as she stood beside him, chin lifted despite the fear still churning in her stomach. "I want to be very clear. That story is fabricated, and we have proof it was paid for by the Cole family in a desperate attempt to salvage a business deal that fell apart because of Vanessa Cole's own cruelty, not because of anything Elena has ever done." He held up copies of the financial records his team had uncovered, handing them directly to the stunned reporters. "Elena Marquez is the daughter of a man who died saving my father's life and mine. She has shown more integrity in the past 6 months than most people I've known my entire life in business. I won't stand by while she's slandered to protect someone else's failing empire." The story collapsed within 24 hours, replaced instead by a wave of coverage exposing the Cole family's financial fraud and Vanessa's desperate attempt at character assassination. Richard Cole's company, already teetering, filed for restructuring within the month. Vanessa disappeared from the social scene entirely, her once untouchable reputation in ruins. Elena, standing beside Nathaniel that night as the truth finally settled over the crowd, felt something shift permanently inside her. The last remnants of the frightened, humiliated woman soaked in cola finally giving way to someone who understood, perhaps for the first time in her life, that dignity couldn't be poured away by anyone else's cruelty. It had been hers all along. A year passed. The Hale Industries Foundation, expanded significantly under Elena's leadership, had grown into one of the most respected employee support programs in the country, funding education, medical care, and emergency assistance for the families of workers who had given everything, sometimes their lives, in service to others. It bore, quietly and permanently, Miguel Marquez's name on its founding plaque. Rosa Marquez, thanks to consistent, high-quality medical care, was stronger than she'd been in years, finally able to attend events with her daughter without exhaustion overwhelming her within the hour. She sat in the front row, beaming with quiet pride, the day the foundation officially opened its new headquarters in downtown Bridgeport, a building constructed, fittingly, just blocks from the apartment where Elena had grown up. Nathaniel stood at the podium that day, looking out at a crowd that included former household staff, foundation scholarship recipients, business partners, And, in the front row beside Rosa, Elena herself, wearing a simple green dress and an expression of quiet, hard-earned confidence that bore no resemblance to the frightened woman who had once kept her eyes down in his ballroom. "A year ago," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying across the crowd, "I stood in my own home and watched someone humiliate a woman I didn't yet realize I owed my entire life to. That moment forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding for 17 years, a promise broken, a debt unpaid, and a family I had failed without ever truly meaning to." He paused, glancing toward Elena, who offered him a small, encouraging nod. Today, this foundation exists because Miguel Marquez chose, in the last seconds of his life, to protect two people he barely knew beyond their names. That kind of sacrifice deserves more than a headstone and a broken promise. It deserves a legacy that keeps giving, the way his sacrifice kept giving to my family for 17 years, whether we deserved it or not. The crowd applauded, but Nathaniel wasn't finished. He looked directly at Elena now, his voice softening. "And to the woman standing here today, who endured humiliation in my own home without ever losing her dignity, who forgave a family that failed hers for nearly 2 decades, who built something extraordinary out of the wreckage of that night. Thank you for teaching me what real strength looks like." Elena felt tears rise, unbidden, as the crowd's applause washed over her. She thought of the cold cola dripping down her collar that night, the laughter that had cut so deep, the small silver bracelet that had somehow, impossibly, unlocked a door back to her father's memory and her own future all at once. She thought about how easily that night could have broken her further, how close she had come to simply enduring the humiliation in silence and going home to disappear into an ordinary, invisible life. Instead, one moment of cruelty had led to the uncovering of a truth that changed everything. Not because she had sought recognition or reward, but because dignity, once witnessed clearly, was impossible to ignore. That evening, after the crowds had gone home and the Foundation's new offices sat quiet under soft evening light, Nathaniel found Elena standing alone in front of the building, looking up at her father's name engraved in gold above the entrance. "He would be proud of you," Nathaniel said softly, coming to stand beside her. "He'd be proud of both of us, I think," Elena said, glancing at him with a small smile. "For finally getting here. Even if it took the ugliest night of my life to do it." Nathaniel reached for her hand, and she let him take it, their fingers lacing together naturally, the way they had over the past year of quiet dinners, difficult conversations, and a friendship that had slowly, gently become something neither of them had expected but both had come to treasure. "I used to think that night ruined everything," Elena admitted. "I couldn't imagine anything good coming from standing in front of 300 strangers soaked in cola, completely humiliated. But I think about it differently now." "How do you think about it now?" Nathaniel asked. "I think," Elena said slowly, "that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are the ones that finally force the truth into the light. If Vanessa had never done what she did, you might never have looked twice at my wrist. My father's sacrifice might have stayed buried forever. I might have spent my whole life quietly resenting a family that never even knew I existed." Nathaniel squeezed her hand gently. "For what it's worth, I'll never be able to fully repay what your father did for my family. But I intend to spend the rest of my life trying." Elena looked up at him, something warm and certain settling in her chest. Not gratitude, not obligation, but something that finally, quietly, felt like home. If there's one thing this story teaches us, it's this: dignity cannot be poured away, no matter how cruel the hands trying to take it. Sometimes the people the world overlooks the most are carrying the deepest legacies, the strongest hearts, and the quietest kind of strength that eventually, inevitably, rises to the surface, not through revenge, but through truth, patience, and grace under the worst kind of pressure. Kindness is never wasted, even when it takes 17 years to come full circle. And cruelty, no matter how confidently it walks into a room, always eventually meets a reckoning it never saw coming. If this story moved you tonight, please take a moment to hit that like button. It truly helps this small channel reach more people who need to hear stories like Elena's. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we have so many more emotional, heartwarming stories coming your way. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that dignity and quiet strength always win in the end, please share this with them. Thank you for watching until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.